The American-led invasion of Iraq is often remembered as a cakewalk. Coalition forces surging into Baghdad in less than 3 weeks and ending Saddam Hussein's 30-year reign. However, Operation Iraqi Freedom is far more complex than at first glance. In this video, we'll cover the true story of the invasion, the Iraqi strategy that took the coalition completely by surprise, the helicopter attack that ended in disaster, and the desperate Iraqi counterattack that almost overran American infantry. All that, as well as the ominous beginnings of insurgency and civil war. This is the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Within days of the 9/11 terror attacks, US President George Bush began exploring options to remove Saddam Hussein from power. For a more thorough explanation of why, you can watch our previous video, but the main argument for war relied on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction.
The weapons of mass destruction that the UK and US were fearful of didn't actually exist. UN weapon inspectors had largely disarmed Saddam. However, Saddam was not fully compliant with UN resolutions, as he didn't want it to become public knowledge that he had no WMDs. Saddam ruled through fear. Murals such as the one behind me were common sights in Iraq, displaying Saddam as a strong military commander or father of the nation. He used the idea that he had these weapons to project an image of himself as a powerful leader to prevent internal and regional threats to his presidency. However, American and British governments used this as evidence that these weapons did exist and were being concealed.
On the 5th of February 2003, US Secretary of State Colin Powell gave evidence before the UN, claiming that Iraq was hiding its WMDs and supporting terror networks. This was followed by a draft resolution in the UN Security Council aiming to authorise the use of force against Iraq. But with France, Germany and Russia set to veto the move, the resolution was withdrawn. The United States was going to war without direct UN support. The group of countries that came together to support the American-led invasion was small. This would not be a rerun of the Gulf War. The forces employed were also much smaller, numbering around 170,000 compared to the nearly 1 million troops used in 1991. But for coalition leaders, that was more than enough. After decades of sanctions, the coalition believed that Saddam's grip on power was weak. As such, they planned to bypass Iraqi cities and race to the capital of Baghdad to surgically eliminate Saddam's regime, whilst leaving Iraqi society intact. According to one Bush administration official, Iraq was a crystal goblet. One tap and it would crack. But while the coalition was planning its invasion, another coalition was making its bid to stop the war altogether.
On the 15th of February 2003, coordinated marches took place across the globe, with millions of people taken to the streets, including approximately 3 million in Rome and 2 million people here in London. It would come to form the world's largest ever global protest. This t-shirt was purchased at that protest in London that was organised by the Stop the War Coalition. The image at the back, showing George Bush as a cowboy walking Tony Blair as his pet poodle, satirises the close relationship that the two world leaders had. It also reflects the public feeling that Tony Blair was just following George Bush into this war when diplomatic options were still available.
Neither side was adequately prepared for the coming conflict. Misunderstandings, flawed assumptions, and intelligence failures permeated the entire planning process. Saddam thought that the CIA was all-knowing, and that American talk of his WMDs was exactly that. He did not truly begin to believe that the invasion would happen at all until the very last minute. The outdated and demoralised Iraqi army held positions on the Kurdish, Iranian and Kuwaiti borders, while the Republican Guard held a series of concentric rings around Baghdad. The Special Republican Guard, the only conventional force permitted to operate within city limits, was expected to fight to the death for their leader. There they would be joined by the paramilitary forces of the Fedayeen Saddam, the regime's most devoted fighters. In truth, Saddam's forces were not in a good way. They were primarily focused on internal and regional threats, and communication between the different military branches was minimal. There was little chance of them being able to stop the coalition. However, Saddam received only positive information from his subordinates and believed he could hold out long enough for international support to mobilise. Saddam took great heart from the US withdrawal from Somalia in 1994, believing that the US Army couldn't stomach heavy casualties. The last book he requested from his press office was Ho Chi Minh's Guerrilla Tactics. He was quite prepared to launch a similar insurgency if he had to. The coalition, on the other hand, missed this almost entirely. Their primary concern were Saddam's WMDs, which they expected him to deploy at the so-called Red Line in a last-ditch effort to defend the capital. On the flip side, the coalition was unconcerned with paramilitary groups like the Fedayeen Saddam, focusing instead on conventional forces. But unknown to them, Saddam had redeployed the Fedayeen from Baghdad to cities in the south of the country. These irregular forces, reinforced by volunteer fighters from other Arab nations, effectively became Saddam's main defence.
There were many flaws in the coalition plan, but the biggest flaw was in the planning, or lack thereof, for a post-invasion Iraq. The secrecy surrounding the invasion meant little preparation was made for what would come next. In the UK, the Department for International Development were left out of government discussions until a month before the invasion, while in the US, the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, which was intended to be a transitional government after the removal of Saddam, was only established in January 2003. This resulted in a lack of understanding of Iraqi society amongst British and US government agencies, as well as confusion over who was responsible for building Iraq after Saddam.
On the 19th of March 2003, the Iraq War began. However, coalition aircraft had already been engaged in Iraq for some time. Since the end of the first Gulf War, coalition aircraft had enforced no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq, keeping the Iraqi Air Force away from Kurdish and Shia areas. But from mid-2002, the coalition went on the offensive. During a secret operation codenamed Southern Focus, coalition aircraft aimed to degrade Iraqi air defences and, if possible, even goad Saddam into attacking them. As a result, the coalition would have air superiority from the off.
On the 19th of March, two F-117s bombed the Dora Farms complex outside of Baghdad after intelligence reports claimed that Saddam was visiting there. However, the airstrikes missed the compound and resulted in a civilian being killed. And it turned out that Saddam wasn't there, with some reports stating that he hadn't visited the compound since 1995. Iraqi forces were expecting a large air campaign, similar to Operation Desert Storm in 1991. However, United States Central Command adopted a shock and awe strategy. This aimed to display an overpowering military force through a simultaneous air and ground force campaign that they hoped would destroy Iraqi morale and their will to fight. On the 20th of March, airstrikes were heard in Baghdad, as key sites were targeted by US forces aimed to eliminate the Iraqi leadership. Around 170,000 coalition troops followed, crossing the border of Kuwait into Iraq to begin their advance.
The first obstacle for the coalition were the huge sand berms on the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. Once engineers had breached them, combat units raced forward. The lack of preceding air bombardment granted the coalition tactical surprise, and Iraqi forces were able to offer only sporadic resistance. This footage shows British forces from 40 Commando in an intense assault on Iraqi oil installations on the Al Faw Peninsula. With American and Polish assistance, they took the southern port of Qasr, while 1st Armoured Division moved on to their objective of Basra. Meanwhile, American forces were speeding on to Nasiriyah. Their main objectives were the bridges over the Euphrates River, which would allow the coalition to advance on Baghdad from two sides. The coalition had hoped to avoid costly urban combat, but the Marines of Task Force Tarawa were soon sucked into just such a fight against the Fedayeen Saddam.
The Fedayeen Saddam were a paramilitary group set up by Saddam's son Uday Hussein. containing Saddam's most loyal and fanatical supporters. Uday was obsessed with Star Wars, so much so that he equipped his forces with Darth Vader-inspired helmets. The Fedayeen were fierce fighters, using weapons such as this one, an Al Nazira RPG-7, an Iraqi copy of the Soviet-designed rocket launcher. We don't know much about this particular weapon, but it was recovered from Iraq by British forces in 2003. It was an effective anti-tank weapon, and it was very popular among guerrilla forces. One of the Fedayeen's greatest successes came during the Battle of Nasiriyah. On the 23rd of March, 507th Maintenance Company took a wrong turn when advancing to the outskirts of Nasiriyah, taking them instead into the city. The Fedayeen ambushed the company, killing 11 and capturing 7 soldiers. Subsequent American attempts to capture the city were frustrated by the Fedayeen's RPGs, mortar and artillery fire. In one confrontation at the Saddam Canal, 18 Marines were killed and 19 injured. This would become the highest loss of life in a single engagement during the invasion.
As the Fedayeen instigated more urban fighting in Samoa and Zubair, coalition eyes remained firmly fixed on Baghdad. To get there, the 3rd Infantry Division would have to advance through the Karbala Gap, a narrow bottleneck between the Euphrates River and Lake Razaza. The choke point was defended by 2 divisions of Saddam's Republican Guard. To ease their passage through the gap, the Americans launched a deep aviation attack by Apaches of the 101st Airborne Division. However, the assault would end in another Iraqi victory. While the preparatory airstrikes arrived on time to soften Iraqi air defences, the main attack was delayed by 2 hours, giving the Iraqis time to recover. When it began, the bright moonlight silhouetted the Apaches against the sky, making them easy targets. The Iraqis put up a hailstorm of anti-aircraft fire, which soon forced the Americans to withdraw. 1 Apache was lost, with the other 29 damaged. It was yet another blow to the coalition plan. Their strategy would have to change. The ambush of the 507th Maintenance Company, the urban fighting in the southern cities, and the failure of the deep aviation attack provided a stark wake-up call for the coalition. Luckily, on the 24th of March, the so-called mother of all sandstorms rolled into the area and halted major combat operations. This gave the coalition time to adjust. They now decided to deploy their operational reserve to secure their vulnerable supply lines. When the sandstorm came to an end on March 27th, the handover began. A reinforced Task Force Tarawa began to clear Nasiriyah, securing the city and the prisoners from the 507th Maintenance Company a few days later. Further west, the 101st Airborne took over in Najaf, and a brigade of the 82nd Airborne began to clear Samoa. Soon, 3rd Infantry Division was ready to move on the Karbala Gap. The Americans were expecting a tough fight for the choke point, but coalition special operations would ensure that it was an easy one.
The main invasion was supported by one of the largest special forces operations in history. A combined Joint Special Operations Force, known as Task Force Viking, secretly entered northern Iraq to join the Kurdish forces. Together, they formed the northern front of the invasion to prevent the Iraqi army from moving against coalition forces in the south. At the same time, the combined Joint Special Operations Task Force West crossed Jordan's border into western Iraq with the aim to find and destroy Saddam's suspected Scud missiles and their launch sites. A task that they wouldn't be able to complete, as these had largely been destroyed after the Gulf War ended in 1991. These operations kept Saddam guessing as to where the coalition's main effort was coming from.
Subsequently, the Iraqis failed to blow bridges near the Karbala Gap or reinforce the Republican Guard division stationed there. When 3rd Infantry attacked on the 1st of April, they met only token resistance. The next day, they captured the Al-Qaeda Bridge over the Euphrates River, the final natural obstacle before Baghdad. A counterattack came from the Republican Guard, but they were obliterated by coalition aircraft and artillery who set up kill boxes along their main attack paths. It was now that the coalition expected Saddam to deploy his chemical weapons, but the attack never came. Instead, Saddam was preparing for a long war. Still hiding in Baghdad, he distributed an 8-page memo to the Iraqi public, detailing how to form guerrilla units and even stage ambushes. But Saddam was vulnerable. Having redeployed his irregular forces, his conventional forces were now falling apart.
The British troops tasked with capturing Basra and the southern oil wells were expecting an engagement with the Iraqi army. Instead, they found abandoned equipment and troops waiting to surrender. This utility pouch was left behind by an Iraqi soldier at an abandoned defensive position on the Al-Faw Peninsula. It was picked up by a major of 40 Commando Royal Marines after securing the manifold and metering station in Al-Faw before it could be sabotaged. He used this pouch for the remainder of the campaign to hold maps, and the M that is written on it was to signal that he had a spare dose of morphine in the small front pocket. During the British advance, thousands were taken as prisoners, with farmers often being mistaken as Iraqi troops. After 1 week, there were approximately 3,000 people detained, with reports that some were left hooded and abused by coalition troops.
Elsewhere, American and Kurdish forces had defeated an al-Qaeda affiliate called Ansar al-Islam and were now engaged in tough battles for Kirkuk and Mosul. In the west, a small detachment of US Rangers was holding on by their fingernails to the Haditha Dam after repeated Iraqi counterattacks. And finally, in the south, the British had Basra surrounded. On the 27th of March, an Iraqi tank squadron made a breakout attempt, resulting in the largest tank battle of the war. But their T-55s were outranged by the British Challengers and 14 tanks were destroyed. By the 6th of April, British reconnaissance raids were meeting little or no resistance in the city. The British then launched an all-out assault from 3 sides, and by the morning of April 7th, Basra had fallen. At exactly the same time, the Americans began to move on Baghdad. With the Marines still a few days away, the 3rd Infantry Division was tasked with isolating Baghdad. This began with 2nd Brigade, who captured a key intersection to the south of the city. Then 1st Brigade moved in to capture Saddam International Airport. The Iraqi troops holding it were some of Saddam's best, the Special Republican Guard, plus some Iraqi Special Forces. On the 4th of April, 1st Brigade breached the wall and moved inside. While resistance was initially light, securing the airport, including its maze of tunnels and bunkers, would take them 2 days. Finally, 3rd Brigade was tasked with capturing key bridges to the north of the city, codenamed Objective Titans. Though they took their objective by the 6th of April, subsequent Iraqi counterattacks resulted in some of the toughest fighting of the campaign. The Republican Guard hurled themselves at the Americans for 60 hours straight in an attempt to escape the city. Nearly overrun, one American company was forced to call in their final protective fires, a command only made when a unit is in mortal danger, and one that had not been given since the Vietnam War. Still, they held on, allowing 2nd Brigade to make their famous thunder runs on Baghdad.
After facing little resistance on their advance to Baghdad, Major General Buford Blount of the 3rd Infantry Division wanted to keep his brigades moving quickly. He decided to embark on a thunder run, a high-speed raid that used armoured vehicles and heavy firepower to overwhelm the Iraqi defence. The first thunder run took place on the 5th of April, when the 2nd Brigade advanced into Baghdad with a convoy of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, where they faced heavy fire from a scattered Iraqi defence. On April the 7th, a second thunder run took place, this time with the objective to occupy the centre of Baghdad. The division advanced into the south of Baghdad, where they received support from the Marines, who attacked from the west. The resistance very quickly collapsed, and by April the 10th, the city of Baghdad was secure. Saddam's regime had fallen.
Saddam made his last public appearance in Baghdad on the 9th of April, before disappearing. While an insurgency would soon materialise in Iraq, Saddam would not be its figurehead. He would eventually be captured in December 2003. With the collapse of the regime, Iraqi units largely melted away back into the population. However, there were still large parts of the country where the coalition was yet to step foot. Over the following weeks, combat operations continued against pockets of Iraqi military and paramilitary forces. First Kirkuk, then Mosul, and finally Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, fell to the coalition. This apparent victory was achieved well ahead of schedule, taking just over a month. The cost for the coalition was also lower than expected, with approximately 172 dead. Iraqi losses are almost impossible to calculate due to the rapid disintegration of their units, but probably number at least 10,000. The number of civilian casualties was also tragically high, with approximately 7,400 killed during the invasion. This tally was only set to rise over the following years.
The end of Saddam's brutal 30-year regime was met with hope and celebrations by many Iraqis. It led to symbols of his regime, such as this mural that was in Qasr, to be taken down or destroyed by coalition forces and civilians. However, Saddam's fall also opened up a power vacuum. Chaos erupted almost immediately with the large-scale looting of properties, including schools, hospitals, and government buildings. Coalition troops on the ground were given no instructions about if and how they should intervene to stop the looting. Brigadier Graham Binns of the 7th Armoured Brigade, who had control of Basra City, concluded that the best way to stop the looting was just to get to a point where there was nothing left to loot. The destruction of Iraq's public infrastructure stirred resentment over the coalition's ineffectiveness to improve the lives of Iraqi civilians that they had promised. This paved the way for the insurgency that would soon follow. On the 1st of May 2003, George Bush stood in front of a Mission Accomplished banner whilst giving a televised speech on the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier. Bush effectively announced that the Iraq War was over, but insurgency was brewing, and with disastrous policies soon to be introduced, the Iraq War was entering a new stage that would prove to be catastrophic.